And welcome to this webinar hosted by the ACT branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. We're very pleased to be joined tonight by branch members and guests from Canberra and, thanks to the wonders of the online format, elsewhere in Australia. My name's Natalie Mobini. I'm a member of the Branch Council and I'm honoured to introduce our speaker for tonight, ANU scholar Dr. Raihan Ismail. Dr. Ismail is an AIIA DECRA Fellow and a Senior Lecturer in the Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies at the ANU. She was the co-recipient of the Max Crawford Medal in 2018, awarded by the Australian Academy of the Humanities for outstanding achievement in the humanities by an early career scholar. Her research interests include political Islam, sectarianism, and the intertwining nature of religion and politics in the Middle East. Raihan has presented at the Centre for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University, the Crawford Australia Leadership Forum, the Canberra Writers' Festival, as well as other academic and non-academic events. She's a regular commentator in Australian and international media on Islam and Middle East politics, including having appeared as a panellist on the ABC's Q&A program. And she's also a published author, including a book on Saudi clerics and Shia Islam, and a forthcoming publication on the transnational networks of Salafi clerics in Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. Raihan will be speaking to us tonight about the Sunni-Shia divide, sectarianism, geopolitics, and othering. Following our usual format, she will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, followed by a similar period for Q&A. You're welcome to post questions anytime by using the Q&A button in your control panel, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can following the presentation. So Raihan, welcome to the ACT branch, and I invite you to begin your presentation.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for the kind introduction and for AIIA for having me tonight. As you mentioned earlier, I will be looking at the Sunni-Shia divide, trying to understand sectarianism, the politics of othering, but also the geopolitics in the region. So let me just share my slide with you. So the talk will basically examine three pressing issues where we're trying to understand sectarian politics or sectarianism in the region. I will be looking at the origins of the Sunni-Shia divide, and then we'll be examining contemporary manifestations of the Sunni-Shia divide. I will be looking at geopolitical rivalry and domestic political circumstances of countries in the region. And finally, I'm hoping to examine the efforts to counter sectarianism, or as some scholars have recently noted, the idea of desectarianization and trying to promote cross-sectarian cooperation in the region. So when we look at the Sunni-Shia divide, the Sunni-Shia split started as a disagreement over who would succeed Prophet Muhammad as the caliph or ruler of the Muslim community. And Sunnis believe that Muhammad's successor should be elected by the broader Muslim community. The Shia, on the other hand, argue that the position was to be passed down within Muhammad's family. So the Sunni-Shia divide can be traced back to the death of the Prophet in 632. Abu Bakr, the first caliph, succeeded him on the consensus of the Prophet's companions, as did the following two successors, Umar ibn Khattab and also Uthman ibn Affan, who was later assassinated by a rebel group. So I'm not trying to complicate everything, but I'm hoping to introduce a few names here. Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's son-in-law and cousin, came to power as the fourth caliph. Supporters of Uthman, the third caliph earlier, demanded justice for his killing. Ali's inability to pacify Uthman's supporters led to Muawiyah, who was the governor of Syria and Uthman's relative, leading an open rebellion, questioning the legitimacy of Ali as the rightful caliph. So the struggle of power between Ali and Muawiyah escalated into a civil war. And Ali's lack of success and willingness to enter arbitration concerning the appointment of the caliph created resentment from some of his own supporters who broke away from his camp. This led to his assassination by a member of the group in a mosque in Kufa. So his son abdicated with the agreement that he was to succeed his replacement Muawiyah. But that never happened. He never came to power as he predeceased Muawiyah. Of course, some Shia believe that Muawiyah poisoned Ali's son. Muawiyah later groomed his son Yazid to succeed him. And after Muawiyah's death in 680, Yazid took over the caliphate over the opposition of Hussein and who was Hassan's brother. And this is important. In Shia history and also in Shia historiography, Hussein set out to travel to Kufa, whose people had pledged allegiance to him. And with 50 armed men and some women and children, he traveled to Kufa, but Yazid sent a large force to prevent him from reaching Kufa. And Hussein's companions and family members were massacred in Karbala. And a few of them survived, including Hussein's sister Zaynab and his sickly son Zayn al-Abidin. So the reason I'm telling the story is because it's so important in Shia collective imagination. The killing of the Prophet's grandson crystallized a Shia sense of victimization and contributed to the formalization of the Sunni-Shia divide and infused a distinct Shia religiosity. The slide, as you can see here, depicts the ordeal of Karbala as imagined by Shia believers. And from this dispute, two religious and political entities were developed. The Sunnis and Shia formulated their own interpretations of certain aspects of Islam, extending to doctrinal beliefs and different prayer rituals. The creedal differences include the issue of succession, as I've mentioned earlier, the position of members of the Prophet's family, the Shia of the conviction that members of the Prophet's family are infallible, while Sunnis believe that infallibility belongs to Muhammad alone. Similarly, due to the issue of succession, most Shia believers reject the legitimacy of the first three caliphs who succeeded Muhammad. Some even believe that the first three caliphs robbed the position from Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. Although it must be noted that Ali eventually became the fourth caliph, as we've seen before. Another aspect that would divide Sunnis and Shia doctrinally is the idea of taqiyya, which means the concealment of faith to avoid persecution. Considering the fact that Shia believers are a minority, they face persecution throughout Islamic history. And as a result, the doctrine of taqiyya was developed during the Abbasid period. And according to the Shia believers, it is permissible to conceal your religious conviction to avoid persecution. And this concept is actually quite alien to Sunni Muslims. There are different views on the Quran and the history of its compilation. That's another issue that will continue to be debated in Muslim societies when it comes to the Sunni-Shia divide. Jurisprudentially, Sunnis and Shia differ on a number of practices, including the marriage of mut'ah. It is referred to as temporary marriage, where two parties enter an agreement to wed each other for a prescribed period of time. So the practice is permissible in Shia Islam, but it is not acceptable in Sunni Islam. And turba, so this is another practice, practiced by the Shia, but not really by Sunnis. The Shia believe, or Shia believers prostrate on turba when they pray, which is definitely not a practice in Sunni Islam. Shia believers also visit the shrines of their imams, and these shrines are located in Karbala, where Hussein was martyred, Najaf in Iraq, where Ali was martyred, Damascus, where Zaynab was buried, and Zaynab was Hussein's sister, who fought valiantly to protect Hussein's sickly son after his massacre at Karbala. These shrines form These shrines form a significant element of Shia collective identity as well. And it must be noted, and this is quite important when we're looking at the divide, there are many Shia sects, and some practices vary from one sect to another. There are also misconceptions about each other that reinforce the doctrinal and jurisprudential disputes. One example is the fact that some Shia believe that Sunnis abhor the Prophet's family. And this is obviously not accurate, because Sunnis hold the Prophet's family in high regard, but they simply believe that succession should not be confined within Muhammad's family. So when we look at the Sunni-Shia relations, so basically we've looked a little bit at the doctrinal differences. I've tried my hardest to summarize that and make it as condensed as possible. We're looking at Sunni-Shia relations, and it must be noted that Sunni-Shia tensions have waxed and waned throughout history. During the Ottoman Empire, relations deteriorated due to the Safavid and Ottoman rivalry, resulting in clashes and conflict throughout the region. The Safavid dynasty, which largely defined modern-day Iran, promoted Shia practices that are seen as inflammatory to Sunnis. So these practices include mandatory cursing of the Prophet's companions, the first three caliphs, and for many Sunnis, the practice of cursing the Prophet's companions is unacceptable, it's deviant, and for Sunnis in particular, that would cause a lot of anger on the part of many Sunnis. So the Ottoman Empire, similarly, through its religious institutions, denounced the Safavid Shia dynasty. And the rivalry was motivated by territorial conquest and struggle over resources. So the religious dimension further, the religious dimension accentuated the divide as well. So when we look at the contemporary manifestations of Sunni-Shia relations, as I've said earlier, the Shia, they are a minority today, consisting of roughly 10% of the Muslim population. However, they are largely concentrated in certain areas. They are a majority in Lebanon, they are a majority in Iraq, in Iran, in Azerbaijan, in Bahrain, and a minority in Saudi Arabia's eastern province, in Kuwait, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Syria, and other countries. There are a number of factors that must be taken into consideration when trying to understand Sunni-Shia relations in contemporary times. One, regional politics or geopolitical rivalries. Second, domestic circumstances. And these are the two issues that I'll be looking at today. When we look at geopolitical rivalry, today we know we're dealing with Saudi-Iranian rivalry, and I think it's important to analyze the evolution of Saudi-Iranian relations to understand the geopolitical rivalry unfolding in the region. Today, when we discuss the Sunni-Shia divide, the geopolitical rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia seems perpetual. Saudi Arabia leads the Sunni world against Iran's Shia alliance. At least that's how the rivalry is being described in certain circles. Media outlets in particular would often describe the Saudi-Iranian rivalry as an age-old schism. However, relations between the two countries were not all time. The modern Saudi state, which was established in 1932, slowly began to develop relations with Iran. In the 1930s, a Persian embassy was established in Jeddah after the signing of a friendship treaty the previous year. Like his father, King Saud, who reigned from 53 to 64, pursued bilateral cooperation, which led him to visit Mohammad Reza Shah in 1955. And both countries were concerned with the rise of communism in the Middle East and anti-monarchist sentiments and Arab nationalism in particular propagated by Egypt and Iraq. So the era of King Faisal, who succeeded King Saud in 64, witnessed increasing interdependence between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Even when we're thinking about the rivalry and the hostility today, relations were cordial in the past. Both countries as ruling establishments worked to resist Gamal Abdel Nasser's republican ambitions, for example, by helping a Shia imam in Yemen to resist the military coup backed by Nasser in 1962. You can imagine the Saudis helping preserve a Shia imamate in Yemen in 1962. And today, they're destroying Yemen because they feel, or at least they're arguing, we're looking at a Shia ascendancy in Yemen. The Shia continued to cooperate with King Khalid, who came to power after the assassination of King Faisal in 1975. And although Saudi-Iranian relations were relatively positive, they were certainly not without problems. Diplomatic conflicts occasionally emerged to act as a reminder of underlying mistrust and suspicion. But relations, as I've said, were largely cordial. Everything, and that's a picture of Gamal Abdel Nasser. My mother still talks about Gamal Abdel Nasser. She's Egyptian, so she has a massive crush on Gamal Abdel Nasser. And when we look at the relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I know that's not so relevant, but that's an important point that I wanted to make earlier. So when we look at Saudi-Iranian relations, everything changed with the Iranian Revolution in 1978-79. Ayatollah Khomeini's determination to export the revolution alarmed the Saudi state, and Iran was now seen as being led by fanatics. In Khomeini's words, we export our experiences to the whole world and present the outcome of our struggles against tyrants to those who are struggling along the path of God, without expecting the slightest reward. The result of this exportation will certainly result in the blooming of the buds of victory and independence in the implementation of Islamic teachings among the enslaved nations. So when you look at Khomeini, he criticized both the Saudi ruling family and the Saudi religious establishment. He viewed the Saudi government as fraudulent and un-Islamic. And he questioned the integrity and capability of the ruling family to properly protect the two holy sites of Mecca and Medina. So the House of Saud, unlike the Shah, had always seen itself as assuming a position of Islam, of leadership in Islam. For example, by hosting conferences to reach out to Muslims in Southeast Asia, other parts of Asia, and also in Africa. According to Tim Niblock, a prominent scholar studying Iran, monarchical Iran's secular values had contrasted neatly, but not antagonistically, with the proclaimed religious values of the Al Saud. The contrast enhanced the religious image of the Saudi regime. Ibn Saud had also vowed to look after the two holy sites or holy cities, Mecca and Medina. He and later his successors invested in the improvements of the condition of the Grand Mosque of Mecca, invested so much money in the reconstruction of the Mosque of Mecca and also Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina. Performing Hajj, which is the pilgrimage which an obligation for Muslims, performing Hajj became more convenient because of the Saudi government's investment in transportation and other infrastructure. However, the Iranian Revolution suddenly threatened the significance of the contributions of the House of Saud to global Islam. Islamists throughout the Muslim world, from Egypt to Nigeria to Malaysia, and whether Sunni or Shia, started to turn to Iran for inspiration. And Saudi Shia, for example, they were inspired by the Iranian Revolution. They expressed solidarity with the Shia of Iran and revolted against the Saudi government in 1979. Subsequently, and overwhelmingly, the relationship between the two countries has been troubled. So the Saudi government support for Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war, which lasted until 1988, is an obvious example that the Saudi ruling family saw Saddam as a force that would help contain Iran. Saudi Arabia's relations with Iran improved to some extent after the death of Khomeini in 1989, Confrontational policies initiated by Khomeini subsided as Iran's leaders shifted their attention to improving the country's economy, which had been significantly affected by the war. So the alteration of Iran's foreign policy can be attributed to Iran's realization of its limited capacity to dominate the Gulf region. They were being too ambitious. Iran's president from 1989 to 1997, Rafsanjani, reached out to Saudi Arabia, and the kingdom responded positively. So even when we're thinking about relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran and the hostility that we're witnessing today, sometimes they cooperated as well. Iran's foreign minister at that time visited Saudi Arabia in 1997. The improvement in relations saw Iran halting its attacks on the credibility of the Saudi ruling family. And more importantly, Iran refrained from actually providing moral or financial support to the Shia in Saudi Arabia, to the Shia in Bahrain, and also to the Shia in Kuwait. And apart from the fact that Khomeini was no longer a diplomatic nuisance for the Saudis, the mutual threat of Iraq helped to improve relations as both countries actually realized that they needed each other to keep Iraq in check. The presidency of Sayyid Muhammad Khatami, who came to power in 1997 and stayed until 2005, witnessed further improvements in ties with Saudi Arabia. He promoted, a tension reduction policy. The role played by Prince Abdullah, the crown prince at that time, who strove to promote cooperation between Muslims, was also a contributing factor to good relations. Official visits were common, became relatively frequent. In 1999, Khatami visited Saudi Arabia shortly after the Saudi defense minister visited Tehran. And this is another phase. When we're talking about Saudi-Iranian relations, the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003 altered the relations between the two states. And the expansion of Iranian influence in Iraq reignited old enmity between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So the invasion of Iraq played an important role in understanding the deterioration of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The confrontational and populist presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who came to power in 2005, did not help. Unlike Khatami, who actively pursued reconciliation between Iran and Saudi and the Arab world, Ahmadinejad showed a strong desire to promote the superiority of Iran and constantly challenged Arab leaders. He wanted to show that Iran is actually more committed to the plight of the Arab populations, and Arab leaders were useless. The civil unrest in Bahrain in 2011 saw the Saudi government publicly accuse Iran of intervening in Bahrain's domestic politics, fomenting the disturbances. Iran, on the other hand, urged the Saudi government to stop its military intervention there. It was so important for Saudi Arabia, at least that's how Saudi Arabia perceived the whole affair. It's important for the country to support Bahrain. They were worried that Iran was going to intervene in Bahrain. Similarly, the accusations of Iranian involvement in the attempted assassination of the Saudi ambassador to Washington in 2011, accusations backed by the Saudi government but strongly denied by Iran, further strained relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Again, the Syrian civil war and the growing conflict in Iraq in the second decade of the 21st century have further accentuated Saudi-Iranian rivalry in the region, as proxy conflicts are fought to weaken each other's regional standing. And similarly, the ongoing conflict in Yemen and Saudi-led military involvement there under the leadership of King Salman, who came to power in 2015, and his son Mohammed ibn Salman, has been justified by the Saudi government as stopping or halting Iranian expansion through the Houthi rebels. As Adil al-Jubayr, who was the foreign minister at that time, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister at that time, argued, Iranian interventions in the region are detrimental to the security of neighboring countries and affect international peace and security. We will not allow any infringement on our national security. He further stated that Iran's role and its direct command of its Houthi proxy in this matter constitute a clear act of aggression that targets neighboring countries and threatens peace and security in the region and globally. Rejecting such claims, of course, Iran rejected the claim, and Javad Zarif, the foreign minister, argued that Iranian aggression is a myth, easily perpetuated by those willing to spend their dollars on American military equipment and public relations firm, and by those promising to protect American interests rather than those of their own people. What's interesting is that once a negative image of another state is developed, hostility is expected, and the state will most likely interpret information to suit that image, even when issues contested are not a matter of significant concern. However, having said this, this does not also suggest that Saudi Arabia's perception of Iran has remained exactly the same since the Iranian Revolution. Different leaderships in Iran have slightly shaped perceptions towards the country over the period. Nonetheless, since 1979, Saudi Arabia has fundamentally perceived Iran as pursuing a sectarian agenda and as a theological and political threat to its interests. So you have actors in the region who would propagate Saudi-Iranian rivalry and promote Saudi Arabia's superiority or Iranian superiority in the region. Saudi clerics play an important role in fostering such rhetoric. And in Iran as well, you have political actors who are arguing that it is important for Iran to maintain its position in the region because you have Saudi Arabia trying to undermine and destabilize Iran. When we look at domestic politics, so this is the second point that I would like to highlight. When trying to understand sectarian tensions in the region, geopolitics is only one factor. At a regional level, these political actors shape sectarian relations by mobilizing support and fostering alliances and undermining each other directly and indirectly. Saudi Arabia treated Iran with suspicion, and Iran treated Saudi Arabia with suspicion. The prospect of active Iranian involvement in the domestic politics of Arab countries with Shia populations, as I've mentioned earlier, is infuriating for the Saudi government. And when we look at Saudi Arabia's statement, a statement by Prince Turki Ibn Faisal, he describes Iran as a paper tiger with steel claws, implying that Iran itself is not really a threat, but that its interferences in the Arab world may cause instability in Arab countries. So you can imagine the perception that Iran will continue to destabilize Arab countries is problematic. And that's why Saudi Arabia and its allies will do whatever it can to prevent Iran from interfering in the region. And there's some truth in Iranian interventions or interference in the region as well. And the same can be said about Saudi Arabia and its allies. However, domestic politics of countries in the region must also be taken into consideration, as I've said earlier, when trying to understand the galvanization of sectarian identity. When looking at domestic politics, I think sectarian identity is an important factor to discuss. The word sectarianism can be problematic. There are a number of scholars who are actually challenging the term sectarianism. I'm not going to touch or discuss the sensitivity of the sectarianism, but maybe if you have any questions, we can talk about that later. But I will continue to use the word sectarianism to make it accessible. So scholars such as Matheson, Potter, Wehry, they argue that sectarian difference has been utilized instrumentally as a method of control. And this is stated by Maven as well. It is common for the Bahraini government, for example, we're looking at Bahrain here. It is common for Bahraini government to blame Iran for civil unrest involving its Shia population, thereby avoiding having to address the economic and political marginalization of domestic Shia community. Yes, we're looking at geopolitical rivalry. However, domestic concerns play an important role in trying to understand the galvanization of sectarian identity. So when you look at Bahrain, the Bahraini government easily blames Iran, but it does not really deal or address genuine concerns or the grievances of Bahrainis in the Shia in Bahrain. This does not suggest that Saudi Arabia and Iran are not genuinely concerned about Iran's influence earlier and its role in inciting unrest within the region. There are protests in Bahrain throughout the 90s, and then in 2007, Saudi Arabia and the Bahraini government accused Iran of being behind these protests and threatened military intervention. So when 2011 happened, the Saudi government and its allies were worried about the revolutionary forces in the region, decided to act quickly and support the Bahraini ruling family. And it was easy because they used the sectarian card to delegitimize the revolution in Bahrain, or the uprising in Bahrain. So the Arab uprisings that began in 2010, December 2010, spreading to Bahrain in early 2011, renewed the aspirations of Bahraini Shia for reform. Here we're talking about domestic politics and the demand of Bahraini Shia for political reform, and also demanding that the government end economic marginalization. They initially called for more political freedoms and economic equality, and some protesters went further and demanded the end of the Al Khalifa regime, and this became really problematic. This alarmed the Bahraini ruling family. It opted for a complete crackdown on protesters after briefly trying to pacify them with promises of reform. And although the protesters were driven by grievances in both the Sunni and Shia communities, they quickly turned sectarians. There were Sunni protesters as well. However, the protests quickly turned sectarian due in part to the Bahraini government's selective onslaughts on Shia protesters. They were targeting the Shia, not the Sunnis, and the state's media's role in blaming the uprisings on the island's kingdom's Shia population. Here, marginalization, whether real or imagined, contributed to the sense of persecution for the Shia in Bahrain, thereby strengthening their sense of Shia identity. The state's narrative against the Iranian threat and Shia disloyalty in Bahrain alarmed Sunnis in Bahrain, disrupting Sunni-Shia relations in the country. And this is despite the fact that Sunni-Shia intermarriage was common in Bahrain until the 1990s. So another factor when we're looking at domestic politics and the galvanization of Sunni-Shia identities, authoritarianism and brutal dictatorships are another factor in understanding the entrenchment of sectarian divide. Iraq is another example when we're trying to understand the galvanization of sectarian divide. Iraq, during Saddam Hussein's rule, saw the persecution of the Shia. The late 1970s witnessed the expulsion of thousands of Iraqi Shia to Iran for their alleged Persian connection, which further isolated the Shia population. So Shia clerics, including Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, for example, was very respected, was highly respected by the Shia for his religious scholarship, spoke of the Sunnization of the governing elite in Iraq. I shouldn't have used that word, it's very difficult to pronounce. From the 1970 to 1985, the regime killed 41 Shia clerics, including the prominent Baqir al-Sadr himself, Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, and expelled Iraqi Shia families. This did not change the fact that during the Iran-Iraq war, many Shia sidelined any sectarian affiliations they may have had with their Iranian neighbors And despite suffering discrimination at the hands of the Ba'ath regime, they generally fought loyally for their country. They demonstrated this sense of loyalty to Iraq. This was especially the case after 1982, when the war shifted to Iraqi territories. However, after the coalition forces defeated Saddam Hussein's army in 1991, after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the Shia in Iraq rebelled against Saddam Hussein only to be crushed brutally. It was estimated, this is in 1991, it was estimated that 100,000 Shia were massacred. The memory of persecution galvanizes Shia identity. Fanar Haddad, a prominent scholar looking at sectarian divide or Sunni-Shia relations, looks at Iraqi Shia's reflections of the 1991 uprising. According to him, one woman related that she was never aware of her Shia identity until after the massacre. It became pronounced as she witnessed the fear and the horror of regime brutality. As I've mentioned earlier, economic marginalization, failed services, debilitating infrastructure, weak state, authoritarianism, and many other factors contribute to the entrenchment of the divide. These conditions strengthen group identity as they are unable to rely on the state. If you're looking at a weak state or a state that is authoritarian, we become more reliant on community leaders and families, and these sources become a source of comfort and security, further undermining national unity. So the issues that affect Sunni and Shia locally do not stay within the remits of the domestic realm. These issues are not just national, they are transnational. They incite Sunni-Shia identities regionally and in some cases globally. The Iraqi civil war, which lasted until, from 2006 to 2007, the Bahraini Uprising, as well as the Syrian civil war, received sympathetic support from Sunnis and Shia in the region. And these conflicts or uprisings are, in the words of Haddad again, sect-coded, labeled as sectarian motivated, and therefore you're looking at the Syrian conflict and you think it's actually motivated by sectarian ambitions, but it's actually more complicated than that. Although they are a result of structural, political, economic, social, and religious marginalization, some actors were successful in labeling these conflicts as purely sectarian. Media outlets and political commentators were quick to blame the Sunni-Shia age-old schism as the cause. In the context of Syria, the conflict was referred to as Sunnis taking to the streets protesting against the Alawite rule. The news also covered the Sunni-Shia divide and how the hatred between the two groups is ancient. And of course, there's no denying that the majority, in the words of Haddad again, the majority of protesters were Sunnis in Syria, but so is the demographic makeup of Syrians. So it's only natural for Syrians to take to the streets because they are challenging the structural marginalization and also the brutality imposed on them by the state. Saudi Arabia, there are actors who benefited from turning the conflict into a sectarian matter. Saudi Arabia and its allies supported the narrative of Sunni repression. Hezbollah and Iran's counter-narratives highlighted violent jihadi groups as the motivating factor for fighting in Syria. So the Saudis are saying that the Alawites, the Hezbollah and Iran, trying to create a Shiite state in Syria, and Hezbollah and Iran accuse jihadi groups of permeating Syria, causing a lot of problems in Syria. The Sayyida Zaynal shrine, we talked about Sayyida Zaynal shrine earlier. It became the rallying point for Shia mobilization in Syria, the reminder of Shia persecution and the bombing of Shia shrines in Iraq in post-Saddam era by Al-Qaeda colored the rhetoric of Hassan Nasrallah and Iranian leaders. By mid-2013, it became evident that Hezbollah, Iran, and the Iraqi-led government supported by Bashar al-Assad were involved in Syria. So you're looking at Hezbollah being a powerful actor in the region, Iran, Iraqi Shia militias participating in the conflict in Syria, and their participation was viewed as motivated by their desire to promote Shia ascendancy. This created a new Sunni fervor in the region, as many saw a Shia alliance emerging. Sunni commentators declared Hezbollah as deceptive and that they had betrayed the broader Muslim community. And it's quite interesting because Hezbollah was previously celebrated by both Sunnis and Shia. In 2006, when Hezbollah fought Israel, great, thank you. I'm almost done. It was hailed, when Hezbollah fought Israel, it was hailed as a group committed to the preservation of Palestine, of Lebanon, Islam, and not a group motivated by sectarian affiliation. The Syrian civil war changed everything. Hezbollah was viewed as a country committed to promoting sectarian superiority. Countries with insignificant Shia population began to highlight Shia treachery, especially as images of the war surfaced and were shared on social media. Egypt is an example, a country of 100 million with about 100,000 Shia population, witnessed intense anti-Shia rhetoric in support of Sunnis in Syria. In 2003, 4 Shia believers were publicly lynched in broad daylight in Cairo. So going to the idea of desectarianization that I wanted to talk about earlier, it is noted by some scholars how an identity, particularly Haddad, how an identity is constructed, imagined, performed, and expressed is anything but static. But it is especially vulnerable to the transformative impact of conflict and violence. Even the content and meaning of an identity, which seemingly timeless symbols or eternally sacred myths are prone to change and fluctuation, and change and fluctuate. So it's the idea that identities continue to change. I'm quoting Haddad here. Precisely because of the nature of identity and its social construction and reconstruction, scholars argue that it can be deconstructed, it can be changed, it can, the entrenchment of sectarian identity can be undone as well. We have seen the destructive force that ISIS brought to the region, the massacre of the Shia and the brutality against the Shia spooked people in the region. And more voices in the region reject sectarian violence today. Even some Saudi clerics, they're known for their anti-Shia rhetoric, discarding their previous statements. They're saying that, oh, we were, wrong to declare all Shia as removed from Islam. The recent Iraqi protests highlighted the grievances of Iraqis with the country's political elite and Iranian interference in Iraq. So the protests were concentrated not in Sunni areas, but in Shia areas, including Najaf, Basra, and Karbala. The protesters were met with brute force by the Shia-led government. And although COVID-19 gave repressive regimes an opportunity for containing dissidents, these protests in Iraq symbolize Iraqi rejection of sectarian-based politics. And the Sunnis in Iraq, although they were too scared to participate in these protests, they demonstrated solidarity with fellow Shia Iraqis through social media, demanding better infrastructure, the end of corruption, accountability, and social services. At the state level, scholars such as Mehban discuss desectarianization as a process of creating stability in the region through good governance, which is very important if you want to downplay sectarian identity. He talks about ensuring that the majority of the population are not excluded from the political and economic processes. It is also important, according to him, for regional powers to work together to find lasting political solutions to conflicts in the region. Unfortunately, this is easier said than done. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much, Raihan, for taking us through what is an incredibly complex subject across a complex region, but one that's obviously so important for understanding not only the deep history, but very contemporary developments. And, we have about 150 people who've been tuning in for the presentation, and we have quite a lot of questions that have been posted. So I'm going to share those, and in some cases see if I can combine a few of them together so that we can cover as many possible through the remaining time. The first question comes from one of our state colleagues in Victoria, Patrick Moore, who asked, Raihan, I've led study tours to Iran and Indonesia in the past couple of years. I understand the Sunni-Shia divide, but to me we now have another divide, Wahhabism. Should that be seen as a new schism, or how does Wahhabism relate to this, this sectarian picture you've been describing?
Thank you so much for that question. It's always quite complicated when we talk about Wahhabism, because for the Saudis, they believe it's a derogatory identification of Salafism. So they believe that they're Salafis, they're the followers of the pious ancestors and the followers of the first generations of Muslims. So they want to emulate the pious ancestors, and they're very respective of the first three companions of Prophet Muhammad. With Wahhabism or Salafism, I think people use it interchangeably, of course. They promote a more rigid interpretation of Islam. The rigidity comes from the idea that you need to preserve the authenticity of Islam. So basically, Islamic creed or religious creed is so important. The doctrine of absolute monotheism is so important. And when you look at the Shia, they visit Shia shrines. The Wahhabis accuse the Shia of worshipping these Shia imams or Prophet Muhammad's family. Again, there's a lot of misconception there as well, because for the Shia, they would say that we're not worshipping Ali or Hussein. We visit shrines as a matter of remembrance, as a matter of respect for Hussein and his family. And it becomes really quite complicated because of the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam. It's very rigid, socially conservative. But when it comes to the sectarian or Sunni-Shia divide in particular, or Shiism, the Wahhabis cannot tolerate a number of Shia practices. The idea of Prophet's companions, Ali's position as the first Imam. Also, some of the Shia practices are seen as problematic by the Wahhabis. I would argue, that's just a little bit of trying to explain Wahhabi positions towards the Shia, or Wahhabi attitudes towards the Shia. I would argue that there are voices within the Salafi movement or the Wahhabi movement that are trying to challenge that rigid interpretation of Islam. So you do have some progressive Salafi clerics who are questioning that rigid interpretation of Islam. So they're saying that, look, we cannot declare the infidelity of Shia believers because we do not really have the authority to declare the infidelity of others. So again, there are very, progressive voices, but they're very marginal within, Salafism. The idea, and this is what's quite interesting as well, is that when it comes to the Salafi clerics, their attitudes fluctuate, their attitudes change depending on the geopolitical circumstances of the region. Before the Iranian Revolution, they were not very vocal against the Shia, but after the Iranian Revolution, the world witnessed Salafis and Wahhabis coming together to construct anti-Shia narratives. Even though we're talking about these actors or Wahhabism as a religious movement, but political factors play an important role in trying to understand how they operate within the region, and particularly how they deal with the Shia.
Thank you. And we have a number of questions that have come through that really relate to the policy of Western powers towards the Middle East. One is around whether lack of understanding of this issue has been detrimental to Western foreign policy in the region. And a number of others are asking really around the American position, which has been so strongly in support of the Saudis, what have been the reasons for that, and whether that has been a mistake.
Again, a very good question. Of course, when we talk about US foreign policy, that is often blamed for creating so many problems in the region. The invasion of Iraq is definitely something that scholars would argue contributed to the entrenchment of the sectarian divide in the region. We're looking at the rise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and how the US played an important role. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, because I know some people would say, the US was involved in creating Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That's not true. But the invasion, provided a conducive environment, because you're looking at instability, you're looking at sectarian hatred. It provided a conducive environment in fostering or allowing jihadi groups to operate in some of these countries. So I think definitely, they're partly to blame for what's happening or creating the sectarian tensions. The lack of understanding, I think that's also another factor. In the past, people have talked about the Balkanization of Iraq, dividing Iraq into three parts. You have, one part for the Kurds, another part for the Shia, another part for Sunnis. And the talk was really problematic because it's more dynamic, it's more complicated. As I've mentioned earlier, Sunni-Shia relations have waxed and waned as well. You have Sunni-Shia intermarriage in Iraq in the 1950s. So it's not that simple when we're talking about dividing a country like Iraq. So I think, the policy and the misunderstanding, misconceptions about the region, causes, problems in the region as well, or cause problems in the region. So with Saudi Arabia, I think that's the third question, if I'm not mistaken, Natalie, is that correct, on Saudi Arabia's US support Saudi Arabia? Yeah. Of course, this is an ongoing discussion. We're looking at Saudi Arabia being quite emboldened in the region. And Saudi Arabia today is very different from Saudi Arabia during King Abdullah's era. And previous rulers in Saudi Arabia, I would argue strongly that they were very different. At least they tried to comply with international norms. At least they're trying to demonstrate that they want to be part of the international community. Saudi Arabia today is a little bit different. I think you're looking at a ruler and his son, particularly Mohammed bin Salman, trying to reshape the region. And Mohammed bin Salman is definitely more bold than any Saudi or previous Saudi rulers. The lack of respect for rules in the region is so obvious. We've seen Mohammed bin Salman and also, his allies attacking Yemen, or the military, not intervention, but position in Yemen. I think that's something that, became really quite problematic. We're also looking at Mohammed bin Salman detaining the Lebanese prime minister and apparently manhandled him, allowed his advisor to manhandle him. Was really quite an interesting development as well. So we're looking at a Saudi Arabia that's trying to assert its position in the region, being more active and trying to shape the region as well. So I think with Donald Trump, we're looking at someone who's not really concerned about what the Saudis doing. So again, that's also another issue to be taken into consideration when we're discussing the region. It's more complicated, but that's definitely something that we need to observe in the region. And the Saudis have allies. It's not operating alone. We're looking at the counter-revolutionary forces in the region who would do anything to prevent people from taking to the streets, or anyone from protesting. against authoritarian regimes.
Thank you. We have another set of questions that are, I guess, asking about the impact of the broader sectarian tensions on Muslim communities closer to home for Australia. I mean, we know that the majority of Muslims in the world actually live in the Asia Pacific region outside the Middle East. And what has been the impact of these tensions on places like Pakistan, India, Indonesia? Is it something that either of those countries seeks to either Iran or Saudi Arabia seek to mobilize? And there was another question that was around whether there are active attempts to convert from Sunni to Shia or vice versa.
I think in the 1980s, or after the Iranian Revolution, Islamists in the region and other parts of the Muslim world, including Indonesia and Malaysia, celebrated the gains made by the revolutionaries. So they supported Khomeini's revolution because they saw Khomeini as someone who's committed to promoting Islam, someone who fought to protect the downtrodden, the disenfranchised against Western powers. So there was a lot of celebration in the Sunni world, if you want to put it that way, in Muslim societies, Sunni majority countries. I remember, I wasn't there, but I remember Anwar Ibrahim, for example, celebrated. And in fact, Anwar Ibrahim was very fond of Ayatollah Khomeini at that time, thinking that the Iranian Revolution, that was a great thing. And that gradually changed, I think, because of Saudi petrodollar. The Saudis were very active in the region, trying to educate people about the dangers of supporting the Iranian Revolution, arguing that it's not really an Islamic revolution. The Shia are deviant. They're not true Muslims, and therefore we have to be very careful, to support the Iranian Revolution. And if I can relate a personal story, growing up in Malaysia in the 1980s, my father, who was a school teacher, went to one of the states for training, because he was a school teacher, so they had training. And there were some Saudi scholars there talking about the Iranian Revolution. This is in the late 1980s. Talking about the Iranian Revolution and arguing that you have to be very careful in Malaysia. You guys don't know what's happening. You think that the Iranian Revolution is a good thing, but it's not. So basically, demonstrating the dangers of the Iranian Revolution, not in support of Iran. So I think petrodollar played an important role in educating Sunnis, the way they, informing Sunnis to be careful of the Shia. Having said that, the Syrian civil war, I would argue, changed everything. Many Sunnis in the past were not aware of the Shia. You ask an Egyptian in the 90s about the Shia, they would say, yeah, Sunnis and Shia, but they're not very familiar with the Shia. Or in Jordan or in other countries, they're not really familiar with the sect, because when you don't have to deal with the Shia, it's not something that you think about. However, the Syrian civil war, through social media, the perception that it was really sectarian, the perception that Sunnis were marginalized, were brutally targeted by the Alawites, galvanized Sunni solidarity. And I think that became prominent in the rhetoric of various actors in Indonesia, various actors in Malaysia, in Pakistan. I'm not sure about India because I'm not really familiar with the Sunni-Shia makeup in India. Of course, there are Sunnis and Shia in India, but I think in India it's more of Muslims being targeted by others, and therefore there's a lot of collective solidarity because they're being targeted. But that is something that you probably have experts who will be able to talk about it. But in other countries, the Syrian civil war changed everything. Even in the context of Australia, The idea that you're traveling to Syria for jihadis who want, or foreign fighters who wanted to support their Syrian brothers, they argued it was motivated because they wanted to protect Sunnis in Syria. So a Moroccan former jihadi who traveled to Syria, fought in Syria, decided to go because he said the Sunnis were being massacred and it was impossible to sit back and not do anything. He went to Syria, joined Jabhat al-Nusra, was fighting ISIS, came back and said that, I don't know, I was not fighting the Assad regime, I was just fighting ISIS. So either I die for a cause I no longer believe in, or I come home and risk being arrested. So he decided to come home. But the point is the Syrian revolution, I think, or the Syrian uprising changed the attitudes of many Sunnis. They became more aware. As I've mentioned in the talk earlier, Egypt, for example, witnessed Syrian solidarity conferences being organized by the government, and Sunnis who were previously not so concerned about the Shia started talking about the Shia and therefore targeting Shia communities or small community, very small community in Cairo. There's obviously, when it comes to conversion, the case of Indonesia, I'm not really familiar, not really an expert in Indonesia, but there are, of course, accusations that the Shia are trying to convert Sunnis in Indonesia to Shiism. The issue of conversion becomes really problematic because you see the Shia trying to increase the population in various countries. That's always the case when you're demonizing the other, saying that they have an agenda to actually change the demographic balance in the country. Malaysia is the same as well in terms of the accusation that the Shia are trying to convert Sunnis to Shiism. Egypt, the same. In 2013, a number of Shia scholars in Egypt were arrested for trying to convert Sunnis to Shiism. So the issue of conversion is definitely used. Whether it's real or imagined, that's another issue that we can discuss.
Mm-hmm. Yes, unfortunately, we're out of time for our session tonight. It's been a fascinating discussion that has generated a lot of stimulating questions. So it seems to me that we're going to have Raihan back to the branch in coming months, hopefully in person, where we can continue that discussion. But thank you so much, Raihan, for joining us and for your very erudite presentation tonight.